Hey everybody, how's it going? In today's video, I'm going to show you an easy way to deploy the TIG Stack or Telegraf, InfluxDB, and Grafana stack using Docker Compose. I've created this GitHub repository that you can find in the video description, which we'll need to clone in order to start to customize our configurations and deploy the stack. So that's the first thing I'm going to do is to clone this repository, and then I'm going to open that repository up in VS Code. Now, you should have a folder structure that looks like this, and the first file that we're going to take a look at is the .env file. And this file is used to define all the environment variables that are going to be used throughout the setup of the TIG stack. So you can leave the init mode environment variable alone. You can leave that to setup. However, we are going to change the username, password, and admin token. So these are going to be the credentials that you're going to use to log into InfluxDB as far as the username and password goes. And then the admin token is actually going to be the admin API token that Telegraf and Grafana are going to use to communicate with InfluxDB. So I'm going to set these to something that isn't the most secure just for the purposes of these videos. For the admin token, we can actually generate a random 32 character hex string by running openSSL rand-hex32, and this will generate a random 32 character hex string. The next thing we're going to define is the organization and default bucket name, or the initial bucket name. Feel free to change these to whatever you like. I'm just going to name mine Huntabyte and the Telegraf as the bucket name because that's what information is being fed into InfluxDB. Now for the InfluxDB initial retention period, it's actually set by default. If you don't define anything, it's set to infinite, which can be dangerous if you are running this in a lab environment and you forget to stop streaming data to the database. It can start to add up with regard to your disk space. So I set this to 4 days for this because this is more meant for a lab. Obviously, if you're deploying this in an enterprise environment, you would probably install things a little bit differently. Now, when it comes to the port and hostname definitions, this is the default port that InfluxDB runs on, port 8086. And the host name, this is what's going to be used to communicate between InfluxDB, from Grafana to InfluxDB, and from Telegraf to InfluxDB. So make sure this is something memorable. If not, just leave it alone at InfluxDB. And then for the Telegraf configuration path, we can also leave this alone because this is pointed directly to this folder here that you should have cloned from the GitHub repository. And then if you have a specific need to change the port that you're going to access Grafana from, you can do that here as well. But in my instance, I'm going to leave this alone. So we'll save that file. The next thing we're going to take a look at is the Telegraf configuration file. Now I've left all these values at default except for the output method. So this is what a default Telegraf configuration file looks like. It has a ton of comments. Since there's so many different plugins that Telegraf supports, there's a lot of options here. So feel free to explore this and change it to whatever you'd like. I know that Cisco has a pretty popular plugin for their model-driven telemetry that you can set up, but everything has been left at default, which means that we're collecting metrics from our host. We're just collecting some basic CPU, memory utilization, disk IOs, etc. But one thing that we did change from the defaults is the output source. If you scroll down to line 999, you'll see that we have an output configured to InfluxDB v2. Now it's very important, especially if you're following this video, that you use the _v2 because otherwise it will not properly connect with InfluxDB. There's some pretty drastic differences between InfluxDB 1.x and InfluxDB 2.x. So something to keep in mind. Now the URLs that we're using here that are going to be used to define what the actual output source's URL is, these are already predefined inside of our environment variables. So the good thing is that if you set those up, you don't have to change any of this information, as well as the admin token or API token, the organization, and the bucket. So all of this stuff can remain at default. And if we scroll down, we will see the default values, the default metrics that are being collected. And these are inputs. So what is coming in the Telegraf that it's going to process and then send over to InfluxDB. And for this use case, for this simple deployment video, we're just collecting these default metrics. The next thing we're going to take a look at is the dockercompose.yaml file. And pretty basic setup. We're running 3 services. We're running InfluxDB, Telegraf, and Grafana. And I have these images version locked just because I've tested this and I know it works, but feel free to experiment with different versions, especially if any new vulnerabilities or bugs are patched. Feel free to change these if you'd like. We also have volumes created on all 3 devices. The ones on InfluxDB and Grafana are actually named volumes that are going to ensure that our data persists across, bringing the containers up and down. So you can stop the services and restart them and your data will still be there. You'll still be able to log in. We're also passing the .env file into Telegraf and InfluxDB, and you will see why we're using it for InfluxDB in a moment with this entry point.sh script. However, with Telegraf, as I just showed you within the configuration files, the environment variables are passed there to help configure that file. And then it depends on InfluxDB. So obviously, since Telegraf is sending all of its data to InfluxDB, it doesn't make any sense to have Telegraf running without InfluxDB running. And then we have the ports mapped to the environment variables as well. And then with Grafana, we are depending on InfluxDB and we're defining that port. So a very simple Docker Compose file, nothing too complicated here. The last thing we'll take a look at is the entry.sh file. And this is what's going to be ran as soon as our InfluxDB service is started. So it's going to try to export all the environment variables that were passed in from the Docker Compose file, which we passed all the environment variables here through that .env file. And what this essentially does is it protects it from continuing with an error. So if one of these values is not defined or if it can't find specific environment variables, then it's going to stop the script from running and you're going to get an error so that you know something failed. And then it begins the influx setup through the CLI. So this essentially just takes care of a lot of the grunt work that would go into setting it up through the user interface. It's taking all the information that was defined in that .env file and passing it here through their CLI script. So I'll leave a link for InfluxDB CLI documentation in case you want to customize some additional fields, but I feel like I've covered most of what is expected to be configured here. So with that being said, we can go ahead and run our containers. So we can do that by opening up a terminal and running docker compose up -d for detached. That way it's not occupying our terminal window. And then we can verify that the services are running by docker container ps. And as you can see here, we have all three of our services are up and running. And if you want to view logs for any specific service, it's actually fairly easy to do so. You just run docker logs -f and then type the name of the container. So we'll just run one for Telegraf, for example. And we can see that tags are enabled. We have a host that's been connected and we have the outputs that have been loaded. So with that being said, we're good to log into our InfluxDB through our web browser. And we can get there by going to localhost 8086 and log in with the username and password that you specified in the .env file. So it looks like everything was properly set up. We are inside of our InfluxDB dashboard. We can now check to see if the data is actually making its way into InfluxDB. We could do so by going to Explore, and you should see a Telegraf under the from here, or whatever name you set as that default bucket name. And then if you see measurements here, so this is actually pulling these measurements from the Telegraf bucket. So if it wasn't collecting data, you wouldn't see these measurements here. So we can see that we have CPU, disk IO, kernel, mem, processes, swap, and system. All of those were defined in our telegraf.conf file, if you can recall. So for example, we can click on memory. So this is the measurement, and then we want to get the field. So what underneath of that memory do we want to look at? We want to look at the available percent, the available, the active. We're going to look at the used percent. And if we click on submit, we can see that we are in fact collecting data here. And it's saying that I'm using 27% of my memory because I only have a small percentage allocated to WSL. But you can see that we are in fact collecting information, which is great. So now we can get Grafana set up to start building out some cool dashboards. So to do that, we'll navigate to localhost 3000 and we'll log in. The default username and password is admin and admin. It's going to ask you to set a new password. If all goes well, you should be seeing this page where you can begin to add your first data source. So we'll do that by clicking on the add your first data source here. And then under InfluxDB, if you don't see InfluxDB here for some reason, just search it at the top. The first thing we want to change is the query language. So since we're running InfluxDB 2.0, it's recommended that we use Flux. However, it is still in beta for Grafana, but I haven't ran into any serious issues using it yet, and I want to become more familiar with that language. So we're going to be using Flux, and you have to use it with this setup or else it's not going to work. And for the URL, we're going to set it to HTTP influxdb:8086. Remember, because these devices are inside the same Docker network, they can communicate with each other just by hostname. And if you can recall, we defined our hostname in that environment variable file for InfluxDB to match the service name, which is what is recommended. We are going to now uncheck basic auth, and then we're going to set the organization. Now, this is the information that we also added to our .env files. So we're going to make this the same that we set our organization to. For the token, we're going to actually go back and pull that from our environment variables. and the default bucket, which was Telegraf. And if all goes well, you should see that you have found 3 buckets, which is great news. That means we are receiving data. We do have positive communication with InfluxDB, and we're able to receive data from that source to actually build our dashboards. Now let's create our first dashboard. We can go on the left side of here, we can go to create and then dashboard. And Grafana has a ton of customizable capabilities. You can drag, you can manipulate this in so many different ways. It's kind of insane, and it would require probably a full series on that alone just to cover it. So to make things quick and easy and to get you off the ground running, we're just gonna build one single panel. So we'll click on add new panel. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna change the name of this panel to memory utilization. And as you can see at the bottom here, we have a query field, right? So this is right now there's no data because we actually have to query our data source, which we defined as InfluxDB, to actually collect some data. And since we're using Flux as our query language and not the InfluxQL, we don't actually have that query builder here within Grafana anymore. So they expect us to write this in Flux, to write our queries in Flux. And as you can see here, they gave you a space to do so right here. So Flux actually is very similar to JavaScript. I think it might have actually been built from JavaScript. However, once you start to look at it with some practical use cases, it actually isn't too difficult to understand. But what I found to be one of the easier ways to understand how Flux works is to actually use some real data with it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our InfluxDB. And as you can see here, we have all of these values already populated, right? So we are technically querying this database right here by visualizing it within InfluxDB. So what we can do is we can actually click on the script editor button, and we have this query that was used to pull this information. So we can simply copy this and paste it into Grafana. And now we have that data here that we can start to visualize and work with. So the next thing we're going to do is start to customize the way this panel looks a little bit. So as you can see here, it kind of looks ugly. It has this value here. You don't really know what you're reading. We do know this is the use percent. However, it only goes up to 22. So it looks like we're capping out at 22%, which is not the case. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually add a little bit of customization options here. So for the tooltip, that's just what shows when you're hovering over this. So if we hide this, it doesn't show it at all. I like to leave that on. For the legend mode, I'm going to leave that as a list. I'm going to make the line width a little bit thicker. And then this hue looks really nice with a nice fill opacity. You start to see it. And then let's see here for the label. So this is going to be your y-axis label. So we're going to say percentage, and then we are going to adjust the units. So right now it doesn't really know what we're measuring it in because we haven't told it, but we can define right here. We can say percentage 0 to 100. And now it's changed all the values to percents. So it's aware that we are measuring by percent. And we can also set a minimum and maximum. If you don't, it's going to automatically calculate it based on what it receives. So if you go up to 75, for example, it's going to raise the bar to 75. But I like to define this. Obviously, with percentages, there are defined percentages 0 to 100. So we can define that there. And you can see that it's been relatively steady over the past 5 minutes. We can also change the display name of the field. So we can say used percent. And you can see this changes the legend at the bottom. It also changes the tooltip when we hover. And then you can change the color scheme to where it goes green, yellow, red by value. So, the closer it gets to the top, the more red it's going to become. So that's the way I like to view it as well. With this, you can also change, to another type of stat as well if you wanted to change to something else. But I'm going to leave this at time series for now and click save. And then you can begin to add additional panels. You can also add multiple queries if you wanted to query another value. So one example use case would be if you're doing in and out throughput, you could have both the in throughput and the out throughput being displayed here on the same panel. You would just need to add an additional query here and query those values. And that's going to conclude this video. So if this was helpful, be sure to leave a thumbs up. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.